UK and India have had their sixth round of trade talks. Today, the UK Secretary of State for International Trade, Kemi Badenoch, is here in India for talks with her counterpart, Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal. This is the first time that the two countries are talking on the FTA after the new government under Prime Minister Rishi Sunak took oath of office. Kemi Badenoch, the UK Secretary of State for International Trade, is joining me right now. Thank you very much for joining us, ma'am. Let me begin by asking you, what were some of the core priorities that UK and India put forth in this meeting?
So the core priority is for us to have an ambitious and balanced free trade agreement. So we've been having these talks for quite a while, and the negotiations are progressing very well. But we need something that's going to be mutually beneficial to both the UK and India. We already have a lot of trade between the two countries. We are very close trading partners, and we want to build on our existing strong friendship with our ally, India. So we're looking into many areas, goods and services. We're looking at what it is that we can deliver that is above and beyond the existing trading relationship that the UK has with India, but thinking very much about the future. So we want a trade deal that will be working for the next generation, not just this one.
Have you finalized a deadline for concluding these negotiations and making this FTA a reality?
So I have asked that we stop talking about deadlines and we talk about the quality of the deal and not just the speed. So it's about the deal, not the day. One of the things that happened previously was that people were talking about a deal by Diwali when we were really talking about concluding the majority of talks. What Minister Goyal and I have done is instruct the negotiators to work at pace. We had a very constructive discussion this afternoon where we both spoke at the same time. Both negotiating teams heard what we had to say and know that this is something that we would like to conclude as soon as possible. But it has to be the right deal for both countries.
Okay. But would you be looking at any sort of timeline, any hope that the UK has to complete it by March next year or middle of next year? Any kind of broad estimate that you can give us?
So I'm not giving an estimate. It would be fantastic if we can conclude by then. But what I want is to make sure that the negotiators are not under pressure to rush a deal. I want them to do a good deal. The UK and India are both negotiating FTAs with many countries, and all those countries are going to be looking at the standard that is set in this FTA. So a quality deal that is ambitious and balanced is key. We obviously know that this is not something that we can spend forever working on. There will be many things that will take place, such as elections. We've already seen how a change of government can, or an election as we had in Gujarat, for instance, can slow things down. So we don't want those sorts of things to get in the way. So we are, what I want you to take away is that we've asked the negotiators to move at pace, to work quickly, and to not spend time on negotiating things which we know both sides are unlikely to move on. We need to find where there is a good landing zone that both sides agree is mutually beneficial for India as well as the UK.
Right. I would also like to ask you about the concessions that UK is asking for on automobiles and Scotch whisky. What has been the discussion? What kind of duty concessions are you seeking, ma'am?
So you are right that automobiles and whiskey are things that we are looking at within the FTA. What I cannot do is tell you about the concessions we're asking for, because that is not going to be good for what are actually very confidential talks. We don't want India to be talking about the concessions that it is asking for, because we need to make sure that the negotiation is taking place between the negotiators, between the ministers. If we start talking about all of the details of the deal before it's concluded, it makes it harder, not easier, for us to come to a conclusion.
Without going into details, if there are certain core sectors where you would definitely like to defend the interest of UK businesses in this FTA, what would those sectors and product lines be?
It's a very good question, and I understand why you're asking it. So you want to know which sectors we want to defend the UK's interests. But the truth is that we have interests in all sectors. And my job is to make sure that we have an agreement which I can take back home and businesses will understand that we were looking after them in general. Concessions will be made on both sides. India will make concessions, the UK will make concessions, but we don't want people to see concessions as losing out. When you come to agreement, there has to be give and take on both sides. It's not about one side defeating the other. It is about us agreeing on what is the best way forward for us to conduct business. So what I'm not going to say is, oh, there's going to be a concession on, you use the examples of automobiles and whiskey. I'm not going to be talking about what the concessions are. When people see the final agreement, what they will see is an agreement that is going to work for both countries rather than what was given up here or there. That's not how we should think about FTAs. It's a negative way of looking at FTAs. We need to look at FTAs as a positive interaction where we're looking at something that's going to generate jobs, economic growth, investment for both sides.
Right. Ma'am, I'd also like to ask you, you gave us a sense that both sides, both you and Minister Goyal, have asked the negotiators not to spend too much time on issues where there will not be consensus, rather focus on issues where there is some amount of consensus and gather pace on them. Has the original list of chapters, 26 chapters, been trimmed down in this meeting that you had with Minister Goyal? Are you working on an FTA with a narrower set of product lines, services, and chapters?
Yes, that's a good question. So it is not a narrower FTA, but within each sector or within each chapter that we are looking at, there will be some red lines. So what I don't want us to do is spend a lot of time going round in circles on a particular red line in, for example, a digital chapter or, for example, an environmental chapter. We have things which we know we can do that will work for both sides. So it isn't about fewer chapters. It is about making sure that the content is one which is sustainable for the future. And where there are still areas where we don't have agreement, keeping the discussions open beyond the free trade agreement, because we have to remember that a free trade agreement is not everything. We are already doing a lot of good trade with each other. There are already, for example, deals that we did on youth mobility visas. Those are the kinds of things which don't necessarily sit within an FTA. But an FTA is an international treaty. And what we want to do is make sure that the treaty is not going to fall apart because we tried to put things in there that did not necessarily work. So building a strong, sustainable free trade agreement means focusing on the areas where you have mutual interests and you have agreed things rather than doing too much that may not necessarily work in the future. And those are the sorts of issues which we were able to bring out and discuss in the meeting that Minister Goyal and I had today.
So you're saying that you would be leaving aside concerns on the digital sphere, on the environment, leave it to a mutually convenient time beyond the FTA?
Those were just examples. Those were just examples of chapters. In every single chapter, there will be some things that we do disagree on and agree on. So, you know, you gave the examples of automobiles and whiskey, but this is not an automobiles and whiskey agreement. It's a comprehensive free trade agreement. So those are just an example of the kind of things that people will be thinking about. And on every single chapter, if it was so easy, we would have done it already. So one of the things that we're doing is trying to look in the round as a whole package. What can we do to get a good free trade agreement that is ambitious and balanced for the UK and for India?
What are the concerns on labour, environment, IPR that UK would like included in the FTA?
Those are things that are still part of the ongoing negotiations. I can't go into that. There are all sorts of concerns that we will have in every single chapter that India will also have as well. And what I want to do is make sure that we're smoothing the pathway, making concessions that work in the interests of both countries for the greater good.
Ma'am, you had said ahead of these talks that you are not taking up student visas with your counterpart, Piyush Goyal. Would you say that visas for students and professionals is a separate track that you're not linking to the present FTA talk?
So what we're looking at are mobility visas, so the business visas, the professional visas. Student visas, we've never looked at. These are undergraduate visas. India already gets the most number of visas from the UK. It's not something that would be inside an FTA. We may have the discussions at the same time. So, for example, a few weeks ago, Prime Minister Sunak came to an agreement on youth mobility visas. So it doesn't mean that we're not doing visas. It just means that there are some things that go into the text of a free trade agreement and some other things don't go into the text of a free trade agreement. But these are all existing things which we already do with India on both sides of the, with both countries. It's not something that would necessarily come into a free trade agreement, which is my remit. A visa is mainly the Home Office's remit. So it's trying to make sure that people understand that what we're doing around a trade agreement is about setting up businesses, getting corporations to send their employees over either for training or for work, how we can do that in a way that facilitates business engagement. Student visas, undergraduate visas, those sorts of things are different from graduate traineeship, post-work study, and so on.
Right. My final question, Secretary Badenoch, when it comes to an equitable tax structure or legal and regulatory impediments, what are some of the hurdles that you would like India to ease off? Also on the use and storage of data localization norms of India, how do you see them?
So there will be various differences in both our regulations, both from a legal side or even just in terms of how certain things are implemented. And it sounds like you already know what quite a lot of them will be. You just mentioned data localization as an example. I know that this is something that is already passing through the Indian Parliament, and that's not something that I would want to comment on. But we think that there are many good things in that agreement, in that legislation that we would like to see passed. Whether or not it goes into a free trade agreement depends on how the negotiators see this as being sustainable. We don't write laws into a free trade agreement. Your legislators will have to ratify it. So we have to make sure that the way we write the text is acceptable and also accommodates changes that might take place in both our countries in the future. And that's why I was talking about something that is sustainable. It's not just a deal for today, but something that will last generations.
Right. And as an alternative to China, when countries like US, UK want to check the rise of China, how important is it for you to build
So we have had an integrated review that basically talks about an Indo-Pacific tilt. So there is a lot that the UK is doing, and this free trade agreement with India is an integral part of it. We're also in the middle of negotiating talks to join the CPTPP, so the Trans-Pacific Partnership, for example. And I'm having very good talks with counterparts in countries like South Korea. We just did a free trade agreement with Japan. So we're looking towards the whole world because we believe that diversified economies are the strongest ones. No country should rely on any other country too much. Right. It is something that we need to do in order to build links all across the world.
All right. Thank you very much, Secretary Badenoch, for joining us here on CNBC-TV18, giving us your view on the status of the India-UK FTA. Thank you very much for joining us on this broadcast. Goodbye.